October 31, 1994. The East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida. A security guard named Thomas Hendricks arrived for his midnight shift and found something that would haunt him until his final days. Every single door inside the museum stood wide open. Every window unlatched. And in the center of the fort's tower room, surrounded by a perfect circle of scattered toys, sat Robert the doll. His button eyes were no longer facing the display case glass. They were turned toward the entrance. Toward the exact spot where Thomas stood. The doll had moved during the locked and empty hours between shifts. But that wasn't the worst part. When Thomas approached, his flashlight beam trembling across the doll's worn sailor suit and straw-stuffed body, he heard it. A low, rattling giggle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Thomas quit that very night. 3 weeks later, he was found dead in his apartment. The official cause was listed as heart failure. He was 28 years old. But those who saw his face afterward spoke of an expression frozen in absolute terror. An expression that suggested his heart didn't simply stop. It was stopped. And in his rigid hand, he clutched a single strand of synthetic hair. The same shade as the hair on Robert the doll. To understand Robert the doll, you must first understand the house that birthed his curse. The artist house, located at 534 Eaton Street in Key West, was built in 1898. A towering Victorian mansion painted in shades that seemed to shift depending on the light. Turquoise. Gray. Something darker when clouds passed overhead. It was here that Robert Eugene Otto lived as a child in the early 1900s. The Otto family employed several Bahamian servants, and among them was a woman whose name has been lost to time. Some records call her Anna. Others refer to her simply as the Bahamian. What we know for certain is this: she practiced dark arts from her homeland. Rituals involving bones and borrowed breath. And when the Otto family wronged her in ways the historical record refuses to specify, she crafted her revenge with needle and thread. The doll she created stood 3 feet tall, stuffed with straw and Spanish moss. Its face was molded to resemble young Robert Eugene himself, with the same brown hair, the same features. She dressed it in a white sailor suit, identical to one the boy owned. And then she performed a ritual that no written account fully describes. But those who've studied Bahamian folk magic speak of a ceremony involving the transfer of something ancient. Something that hungers. When she presented the doll to young Robert as a supposed gift, she smiled. Those who witnessed that smile said it never reached her eyes. The boy named the doll Robert. From that moment forward, he insisted on being called Gene. Within weeks, the disturbances began. Servants reported hearing conversations emanating from Gene's room. 2 distinct voices. One belonging to the child. The other deeper, raspier, carrying tones that made the hallway air grow cold. When they pressed their ears to the door, they heard Gene begging. Pleading. The words "please stop" repeated like a prayer that went unanswered. Furniture in the boy's room rearranged itself overnight. Toys were found mutilated, their stuffing pulled out, their faces torn away. When Gene's parents confronted him, the boy would point at the doll with trembling hands and whisper the words that became his constant refrain: "Robert did it." But the true horror revealed itself in February of 1906. Gene's mother, Clara Otto, heard her son screaming in the night. She ran to his room and found the furniture overturned, his belongings scattered as though a violent struggle had occurred. And there, standing at the foot of Gene's bed, illuminated by moonlight streaming through the window, was Robert. The doll was standing upright. Unassisted. Its button eyes fixed on the cowering child. Clara would later tell a family friend that when she entered the room, she felt the doll's gaze shift to her. She felt it assess her. Consider her. And then, as though it had decided she wasn't the target it wanted, the doll collapsed into a lifeless heap. But its expression had changed. The mouth that had been neutral now seemed curved into something approximating a smile. From that night forward, the family heard footsteps in the attic. Small footsteps. Pacing back and forth. Back and forth. Always during the hours between midnight and dawn. Gene's parents moved Robert the doll to the attic, locking it in a steamer trunk reinforced with leather straps. They forbade anyone from opening it. But the doll had already established its territory. Neighbors walking past the artist house began reporting sightings. They would see a small figure moving past the turret window, back and forth, watching the street below. Always in the same rhythm. 3 steps left. 3 steps right. Pause. A turn toward anyone who noticed. Children refused to walk on that side of Eaton Street. Parents crossed to the opposite sidewalk without quite knowing why. And then there were the visitors. People who came to the Otto home and were shown to guest rooms. They rarely stayed the entire night. They would emerge before dawn, pale and shaken, insisting they had to leave immediately. Most refused to explain what they'd experienced. But one visitor, a distant cousin named Margaret Thornwell, wrote a letter to her sister in 1912 describing her stay. The letter was discovered in an estate sale in 1978. Margaret described waking to the sound of giggling. She lit her bedside candle and saw, standing in her doorway, the silhouette of a small figure. It swayed slightly, as though keeping time to music only it could hear. When she called out, asking who was there, the figure tilted its head. The angle was wrong, she wrote. Too far. Too sharp. Like something broken that still insisted on moving. She closed her eyes and prayed. When she opened them again, the figure was gone. But on her pillow, beside her head, lay a small wooden toy soldier. Its head had been twisted completely backward. Margaret left at first light. She never returned to Key West. In 1917, she was committed to an asylum in Massachusetts. The intake records note that she suffered from recurring nightmares involving dolls and was found repeatedly drawing the same image, a face with button eyes and a smile that seemed to widen the longer you looked at it. Gene Otto grew up. He became an artist, a painter of local renown. In 1930, he married a woman named Anne. They moved back into the artist house, the place of his tormented childhood. And against every instinct, against Anne's pleading, Gene brought Robert the doll down from the attic. He gave the doll the entire turret room. He furnished it like a child's bedroom, with a bed and toys and a rocking chair positioned to face the window. Anne thought her husband had lost his mind. But Gene insisted. He said that Robert needed to be comfortable. That if they didn't give Robert what he wanted, things would be much worse. And learned what he meant soon enough. Paintings Gene had worked on for months would be found slashed. Food would spoil overnight, turning black and releasing a smell like rotting flowers. And would wake to find Robert in different positions. Sometimes at the foot of her bed. Sometimes sitting in a chair across the room, positioned so its unblinking button eyes could watch her sleep. She begged Gene to destroy the doll. To burn it. To throw it into the ocean. But Gene refused with a terror that bordered on hysteria. He said that Robert wouldn't allow it. That the doll had made very clear what would happen if anyone tried. When Anne pressed him on what that meant, Gene would only shake his head and stare at his hands. At the scars across his knuckles that he'd had since childhood. Scars he'd never explained. They lived this way for decades. Gene painting in his studio while Robert watched from the turret. And growing thinner, more hollow-eyed, jumping at sounds that weren't there. Neighbors continued to see the doll moving in the window. Children continued to cross the street. And sometimes, on very still nights, people walking past the artist house would hear it. A low, rattling giggle that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Gene Otto died in 1974. And lasted barely another 2 years before following him. The artist house was sold, and the new owners found Robert the doll in the turret room, sitting in his rocking chair, facing the window as he had for decades. They initially found him charming. A piece of Key West history. They kept him on display. That was their first mistake. Within months, their 10-year-old daughter began showing signs of psychological trauma. She would wake screaming, claiming that Robert had tried to hurt her. She drew pictures of the doll with rows and rows of teeth. She begged her parents to make him go away. The family's dog, a gentle golden retriever, refused to enter any room where Robert was present. When forced, the animal would press itself against the far wall, whimpering, eyes fixed on the doll with primal terror. Finally, after their daughter was found unconscious at the bottom of the stairs with bruises around her throat and the distinctive pattern of small fingers, the family donated Robert to the East Martello Museum in 1994. The museum placed him in a display case. They thought glass and locks would be enough. They were wrong. Staff members began calling in sick. Security footage showed Robert's head and arms in different positions between frames. Visitors who photographed the doll without asking permission first reported camera malfunctions. Accidents. Illnesses. Job losses. Failed relationships. The misfortunes always began within days of their visit. The museum now posts warnings. They instruct visitors to ask Robert's permission before taking photographs. To speak respectfully. To leave offerings of candy. They receive hundreds of letters each year from people begging Robert's forgiveness. Letters describing the horrors that have befallen them since their visit. Letters written in shaking hands by people who no longer sleep through the night. The museum staff will tell you, if you ask them quietly, that Robert still moves. They find him in different positions when they open each morning. His expression's subtly different. And sometimes, during the deep hours of night when the museum is empty and locked, the security system picks up sounds. Footsteps. Laughter. And the rhythmic creaking of a rocking chair moving back and forth in a room where no rocking chair exists. Robert the doll remains in the East Martello Museum today. Watching. Waiting. Some say the curse died with Gene Otto. But the letters keep coming. The accidents keep happening. And late-night staff members keep reporting the same impossible thing, the sound of small feet pacing behind locked doors. There's something else, though. Something the museum doesn't advertise. 3 documented cases of visitors who ignored the rules, who mocked Robert, who took photographs without permission. They all reported the same experience in the weeks that followed. They would wake in the night to find a figure standing at the foot of their bed. Small. Motionless. Watching with button eyes that reflected whatever dim light was available. And when they turned on the lights or worked up the courage to look again, the figure would be gone. But they would find something left behind. A toy. A small object that wasn't there before. A calling card. A promise. Because you see, Robert doesn't just stay in Key West anymore. Once you've drawn his attention, once he's decided to notice you, distance doesn't matter. Locks don't matter. He comes to visit. And those visits, according to the letters still arriving at the museum, are getting longer. More frequent. More persistent. As though Robert is teaching himself to stay.